the reflections from Arnold. Are human rights part of the local culture? Do we think in terms of human rights? Or these are concepts that have been imported from outside? I think this is the challenge for ZimRights, but also the challenge for all of us. How do we make human rights part and parcel of our culture? When we say there's a difference between theory and culture. Theory is, you sort of switch into it and switch out. That's what theory is about. Us as academics, we invent theories. Some of them are never used by anybody. But when a theory becomes a culture, it means even without thinking about it, you think through it. You do things according to it. And this is the question we are asking. How do we make human rights part and parcel for how we think about our politics, our economics, our cultures, our relationships? This is the challenge. Now, I've been asked to share with you some lessons that you can glean from the best of the church. The church can do worse things, but picking from the best of the church and how to build a movement. I refer to the best of the church because there are lessons from the church that you don't want to learn and you should not learn. I will share with you what I think are good lessons from the church. It does not mean that the church itself follows its own lessons. So, the church as a social movement has succeeded in sinking some roots into African societies. I'm thinking more of the Christian church. We could be thinking about other religions as well, but my tradition is the Christian church. So there are people now who are Africans, but they see themselves first and foremost as Christians. And they live according to the Christian values and principles. When you admire this achievement by the church, you may ask yourself and reflect on whether your movement is doing the same with regard to human rights. To say, can we help Zimbabweans to think and work using human rights values and principles? I think this is the test for sinking roots in the Zimbabwean African society. Here I'm reminded of Diana Jeter's question about dominant political parties. She asks why our dominant political party, I call it, ZANU-PF is dominant in the sense that it's there. Why it continues to have allegiance from citizens, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that they're engaged in violence. There have been murders, which we saw in the exhibition there, kidnappings, corruption, undermining human rights. Why? Is it because citizens do not believe in human rights? This is a question worth asking. Today, I'll not ask you, the ZimRights National Council or delegates, whether you believe and work according to the principles of human rights in your own movement, your structures, your day-to-day lives in your respective communities. I'm sure yesterday you told each other how the role of human rights in your day-to-day lives. I want to talk about the concept of inculturating Christianity. In other words, having Christianity coming from outside into Africa and then being inculturated, being made into a culture that Africans can stand up and say, I'm a Christian. Some even say, they are not inspired by African values. They say, I'm a Christian and they're against African values. How did the church get into that situation? And this is where we want to get to as defenders of human rights to get to a situation where you can say, I'm a human rights defender, I will oppose African cultures which are against human rights. So these are the lessons that I'm saying. What happened to the Christians so that they could influence people culturally to the extent that they could pick up those values and principles even against their own traditional cultures. So I think the idea is to link the faith to practice, that the church has transformed beliefs into a culture. That if we visit many parts of Zimbabwe today, you'll find that there are some Zimbabweans, even traditional Zimbabweans, who have been influenced by Christianity. So even as we are practicing our own traditional cultures, Christian values also enter into there. This is what we're talking about, that how do we make human rights into a culture so that when we are relating to one another in private, when we are relating to one another in public, we are using human rights as our way of seeing how those relationships work. I think that I'll cut my story short because I think a lot of documentation has been established by us as Africans at national levels, even at regional levels, and at global levels. We have endorsed the values and principles of human rights. Whether you're talking about AU or NEPAD, I think it is very clear that we have gravitated towards that. But what we need to do now is to be very creative, to invent various ways and strategies in which our movement carry those values and principles into practice. Creative Christians inspired by the gospel have started social movements, social groups, organizations to implement Christian social values. Others have dedicated themselves to infusing Christian principles into established social, political, and economic processes. Think, for example, of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace. This was an attempt to say justice and peace is important. It comes out of the Christian tradition. How then does it now come into the Zimbabwean situation? That's what the whole thing is about. Caritas, which is also another institution in the Catholic Church, does the same. Helping people who are in distress is a value that comes out of the Bible, out of the tradition of Christianity. How then do we infuse it into the Zimbabwean situation? This is why the church, not just the Catholic Church, but other churches, they build hospitals. No, you may wonder, why should a religious organization bring in a hospital? The idea is health, respect, dignity. These are values that come out of the Christian tradition. So when the church is putting forward a hospital, it is trying to inform and to represent those values in concrete terms. I think this is what we need to be thinking about as ZimRights. Creatively, how could we do things? They may not look as if they are directly related to human rights, but they can become the ground upon which human rights will walk. This is the idea. And I think this is what we can learn from the church, from the Catholic social teaching, from traditions of social justice, from liberation theology. There are a lot of ways in which people have looked at the Bible and said, as Christians, how do we reinvent this Bible into real concrete life? And I'm saying ZimRights can learn from this, that how do we creatively reimagine human rights and create institutions, practices, relationships that reflect those principles. This is why I think that, maybe let me just ask, what do you think would be the most important quality or the most important um, virtue that you as participants in human rights should have? Anybody wants to? A value, a virtue, something that you think if defenders of human rights could have this, then we will go forward in human rights activity. Anybody who wants quickly? Yes, love one another. Love, fantastic. Okay. Who else? Sorry? Courage, yes. Okay, yes. Tolerance. Okay. All this we need. Let me cut the story short. I'm coming here to say imagination. Imagination, the ability to think about Zimbabwe in a different way, to think about our life in a different way. Imagination to say, how do we inculturate human rights? Having activities which, when people go through them, at the end of the process, without knowing sometimes, they realize that human rights are a natural possession for all human beings. So I'm challenging you to have more imagination as a movement, to imagine other activities that you could do, other ways of organizing that you could have, other ways of relating that you could have. So in the Catholic Church, I just go through a list of some of the things that they've done to inculturate religious social teaching. So I'm sure you've heard about community organizing. Yeah? I think it became very strong in London, in the UK, but even in the United States. The idea that people can come together as a community and organize about issues around their neighborhood and begin to find solutions to the issues around their neighborhoods. It's absolutely important. They've been successful in some ways, they have failed in some ways, but these are things that you could experiment with, where you bring people together in a neighborhood, people with similar concerns, they work together, and in the process of working together, they invent all sorts of things you never even imagined would happen. One of the things that I heard Arnold talk about in terms of professionalizing and sort of organizing the organization in such a way that it follows certain principles and they can monitor it and evaluated and so on and so forth, is that we lose a lot of creativity in the process. Because now you want what happens in Bulawayo to be the same as what happened in Nyanga. And so you programmatize everything. And I'm sure ZimRights has lost a lot of creativity through those kinds of things. So let's think about that. Do we have to control every little bit of activity, every little bit? I don't know. But I think that some of these, when they fall into the community, allow the community to take charge of those activities. Of course, the church also, particularly in South America, the Catholic Church took what they call liberation theology and they pushed that liberation theology to the extent that they started talking about popular education. In other words, I'm sure you've heard the educator Paulo Freire. He inspires a lot of our leadership training in our school. Paulo Freire, a Brazilian, who then connected himself to African liberation and was able to reinvent education. You've heard people criticizing normal education to say it's kind of banking education where those who, the teachers, give people education, and then at the end of the year they say, give it back to us, and then we'll mark you, you have passed. And Paulo Freire criticized that. He said, no, let people invent their own education. Let people engage one another and learn from that engagement and provide solutions to the problems that they are facing. This business of thinking that education is anything that comes from Europe, that comes from America, or that comes from somewhere else, that's not education. Education is when it comes from the people themselves. And this is a lesson that has proved to make some impact. Of course, we know the church, the Catholic Church, tried to control it because it was it was challenging some of the structures as well. But we can learn from there. But of course, the idea of basic Christian communities. I know in Zimbabwe we say we have basic Christian communities. We don't. We have sections where people, after Sunday, after the service of Sunday, give time for people now locally to regroup and reflect not just on what was said in church, but also reflect on what is happening around themselves. I think Christians have been able to achieve a lot of things through basic Christian communities. Then, of course, I think I would like now to conclude by going through the different areas of our social, political, and economic life and saying what reflections could we have going forward. I think that in the area of politics, as an organization, it would be good to help to widen our sense of politics. We think a lot, the majority of Zimbabweans think that politics is about party politics. Politics is wider than that. And I think it is important for us as a human rights group to help our country widen the sense of politics. That we must also hold the state accountable, but the state is not the only one with responsibility to fulfill people's rights. We need to look at other players that must be held accountable for human rights. So, for example, we don't do much work around the power of corporations, of business, when businesses undermine our rights. I mean, even at a global level, a lot of our countries, a lot of our politics is determined by business. But there is no global or even regional body which holds business accountable. And yet, a lot of our countries are pushed, our policies are pushed by companies. It's important to do that, to assess that. Also, in the area of politics, how do we deal with global pandemics and challenges that are caused by forces beyond our national borders? There's a lot of poverty in here that is caused not, don't get me wrong, I think our government is responsible for a lot of terrible things. But even they will know that they are not able to solve all our problems. That our problems go beyond them. And it is important when we are dealing with human rights to be able to know that. I mean, they will promise us a lot of things which they know they can't deliver because of the global economic architecture. Okay, so, and then let's go to our economics. I think we need to, as human rights defenders, to understand economics. I know the economists, they present economics as if, all of us don't know economics. No. Paulo Freire says, all of us, because we buy, we sell, all of us must know economics. Now, economists will use a lot of big words and so on. It's up to us now to say we don't want to use big words to talk about economics. We want to use our language to talk about economics. That's what we should be doing when we talk about, when we work in the area. The right to understand and participate in economics is a very important thing. Economics is not a science. Economics is not a science like physics. Economics is a political argument. It's a moral argument. And we have moral arguments. We must push our moral arguments into economics. At the moment, finance is becoming bigger than real economics. When in the history of economics, banks and financial institutions were not counted as productive. They were not part and parcel of what you would say, when you do the GDP, and then you calculate that certain banks have created so much wealth. Because banks don't create wealth. The thing that, we must make a distinction between what is wealth and finance. Finance, its purpose is to support production, to support economic activity. Itself, it was not, now we are in a situation where finance now is becoming bigger than production. And that is very dangerous. It is dangerous because people are getting out of jobs in banks to be selling money on the market. Who's going to produce? This is a big challenge. This is why now we have farm workers without land, we have families without houses or homes, we have workers without jobs, we have human beings without rights. Let me go to human rights needs in our social cultures. I think that Zimbabwe has not done enough to imagine what it means to be Zimbabwe. I think, and this is very important for me, because every time I introduce myself, what's your name? Oh, Kaulem. Oh, where are you from? I was born here. But people don't believe that. So what do I have to do in order for Zimbabweans to recognize that I'm a Zimbabwean? With a name like Piri or Mwale or I don't know. What do I have to do to be a Zimbabwean? Because it is at the center of human rights. What is happening in South Africa? This issue about foreigners and so on and so forth and so forth. It affects human rights. And so we need to do a lot of work imagining about national and global citizenship vis-a-vis nationalism, ethnicity, race, gender. I've asked this question before. Was Joshua Nkomo a citizen of Zimbabwe in the same way that Mugabe was? Let's not talk about what is written in the law. Let's talk about what you feel, your emotional response to Zimbabwe. I've said this before, that they say people from Masvingo are what? Wakaranga. And they also say that those from Murewa, they are what? Mazezuru, Alitka? Yeah. But you know that Chief Gutu goes every year to Murewa to pay respects to his father, isn't it? You know that, eh? So, who is Karanga, who is Zulu here? You know that Chief Serima is a Gushungo, right? Yeah? I don't know. I'm just raising these issues to say, if human rights are to really become human rights, what happens to our ethnicity, the things we have in our hearts, in our heads, and the things we have in our hearts, which inform us to identify ourselves in this way? How human are we if we still cling to some of these concepts that undermine human rights? This is the question I'm asking. We, at the moment, are struggling to accept that we could have a woman president. We always find some excuses in our parties, in our national movements. We always find excuses why we can't have a woman president. In conclusion, I think, look, I'm a dean of the School of Education and Leadership at Arupe Jesuit University. We have diploma and degree programs for transformational leadership, where we are trying to cultivate a new breed of leadership for transformational development. We also have programs in inclusive education to make sure that development is made more inclusive. Human rights require that we have good leaders at every level of our society. I'm hoping that your movement will find reason to work with us. As you celebrate your 30 years of existence, know that it is only the beginning of building ZimRights as a sustainable and transformational social movement. I thank you.
Thank you very much.